I'd like to thank Handong, leading University for Unification Education Unit, for inviting me to give this lecture today. I count it a great privilege to be asked to speak at a South Korean university, and I look forward to giving this talk, and I look forward very much to the questions and discussion at the end as well. But I better get started. My time is going to be too short, and there's a lot of material to cover. So just a couple of relatively small introduction. So who are we? RPI, Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives, is an international NGO. It's a small international NGO based in Geneva and doing its research in Cambridge in the UK. We're relatively new to working in the Korean Peninsula. A lot of our works, as you can see from our experience there, was in South Africa, Rwanda, Sudan, and then more recently in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. So it was only in 2014 that I met Young-Gil Lee, or rather he sort of gate crashed a meeting that we were holding in Britain, I suppose, great way to put it. And he persuaded, first of all, my colleague, Jeremy Ive, who's worked with me since 1986 on peace initiatives, that we should engage in the Korean Peninsula. And I was gradually won over to it eventually and went full-time in 2017. So I've done 3 full years now and a bit in working on the Korean issues. So we have all the disadvantages of not having this long experience of the whole process of North Korea, South Korea relationships over, the last 50 years. We just haven't been part of that dialogue and discussion and politics. And although we read and study a lot, we obviously just don't have a complete picture. I suppose the advantages of being the new kids on the block, as we say in English, the advantage of that is that we perhaps come with fresh eyes. And whereas many people have concentrated on the denuclearization issue, we've concentrated more on other issues to reach our goal of sustainable peace and social harmony. So we think that there are 3 essential building blocks for unification, and I've simplified this down to an equation. So I'm going to give you 2 equations today. I hope your maths will cope with this, but it's not very complicated maths. So unification plus sustainable peace, that is not unification based on the sort of Hong Kong model of 1 country, 2 systems, but something which is going to be sustainable. A sustainable unification depends, we think, on 3 essential building blocks: a shared narrative, a practical plan, and the support of the key neighbors. The key neighbors in this case are the US, China, Japan, and Russia. So notice those multiplication signs. So even if you get the support of the neighbors, you will not necessarily get unification, because if, in mathematical terms, if n is 0 and you multiply s as a substantial number and p as a substantial number by 0, you still end up with a result of 0. You must have all those 3 elements. So those 3 elements again are these. You must have a shared narrative. So what do we mean by that? We mean that that somehow some common values, some shared understanding of history has to emerge, which brings the 2 countries back together again. We see in the US and increasingly in the UK what happens if your country is hopelessly divided between 2 points of view that appear completely irreconcilable. You have to try and make sure that you have some shared narrative. Even if you've got a shared narrative, so you agree with this is what we would like the country to look like, these are the values, this is what it could be, it doesn't work out unless you have some practical plan for bringing out the alignment of your institutions and your public policies. And none of that can be achieved under a sanctions regime that North Korea and South Korea are both laboring under at the moment, unless you can get the support of the neighbors. Now, the talk I'm going to give today will cover at some points, indirectly, a number of these points. But I just wanted to lay out that as the three essential building blocks we believe, from our experience, that you need to achieve unification. So I'm moving on. I think I also just wanted to put this on the table right at the beginning. So our perspective is, rightly or wrongly, and clearly you are free to disagree, but our perspective is that the nuclear threat is not just an issue of capability. It's not just a question of whether North Korea has the capability to deliver nuclear bombs onto North American cities, or whether it can use nuclear weapons against Tokyo much closer by, where you don't need ICBMs, or indeed China. We shouldn't forget China. If DPRK was so inclined, it seems very unlikely today, but it must be in the minds of the Chinese as well, I expect. So the nuclear threat is a function of two things: capability and motivation. That is, do DPRK actually want to fire nuclear weapons? Now, why is the UK not a threat to the United States? We have the capability from our submarines in the UK to deliver nuclear bombs, nuclear warheads onto North American cities, but nobody's worried about that. Why? Because the UK has no motivation to do it. So if motivation is zero, nuclear threat is zero. If capability is zero, I don't know, let's take a remote country like Uganda. It has no nuclear capability, so even if it had the motivation to fire nuclear weapons at the United States would not be worried because capability is zero. You must have capability and motivation. If either of those is zero, then the nuclear threat is zero. So we're suggesting that denuclearization is not the only way to get rid of the nuclear threat from the international community and from the United States. The other way to get it is by tackling the issue of motivation, and motivation in the end is a relational issue. It's an issue about relationships that DPRK has with ROK, with the United States, with its neighbors like Japan. The motivation issue is what we believe has to be tackled. There is an issue of dealing with the capability question. I'm not sure how successful the international community will be with that because of the experience that North Korea looks at in the past, when it looks back to what happened in Libya, what happened in Ukraine, who gave up their nuclear weapons, and they see what happened after those things, the seizing of Crimea and the bombing of Libya and so on. Not sure how they will, whether DPRK will be willing to give up its nuclear weapons. They've certainly said they will not. But the other way to deal with the nuclear threat is to deal with the motivation question. So what is the practical plan? We call it a mutually accepted social and economic convergent development process. So first of all, what is this mutual commitment to a 7-year process of alignment? What's that all about? Well, we're saying it has to be a 7-year process of bringing alignment in both the institutions and the policy goals of DPRK and ROK. Why a 7-year process? Why couldn't it be, say, 3 years? Couldn't we do it faster? I mean, surely the Berlin Wall came down very, very fast, and there was unification of East and West Germany. On the other hand, 47% of East Germans last November, after 30 years, said that they wished there had not been unification. They were happier, actually, under the old East Germany. So if you want people to be happy in the end, maybe you need a longer process to adjust institutions in a way that represents some sort of compromise between the two systems, rather than just enforcing a form of unification which just imposes the values, for example, of West Germany on East Germany or of South Korea on North Korea. You need some process of alignment of thinking and ideas and institutions and policy goals. Why not then take 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years? Well, The reason we think for that is that it requires some element of global stability. And we have an opportunity now because even despite the growing challenges between the US and China, it is a relatively stable international situation that we confront at the moment. But I think it's likely to become a great deal less stable over the next 10 or 20 years. The international financial system is not very stable. There's the issue of China and Taiwan that one day has to be resolved one way or another. There's all kinds of issues which could greatly destabilize what is going on in the countries around the Korean Peninsula. And therefore, it needs to be done with determination, and it needs to start soon, in our view. And we're suggesting that after 5 years of building the trade and the financial flows and the modernization in North Korea, once you get that momentum going, then we think it's possible to start discussions about unification. How and when could the whole thing start? Well, RPI is still hoping and believing in faith as a Christian body that we are hoping and praying that it will start in April next year for a number of reasons, which I will discuss later. So the second, so if the first component was mutual commitment to a 7-year process, DPRK and ROK, first of all, have to agree they both want to do it. Now, we'll discuss why they might want to do it again later, but they must both agree. It must be a mutual commitment. Secondly, there has to be a gradual opening of trade and financial flows. We're suggesting that this is one sector at a time. You might say, well, why not do it faster than that? Why not go, for all sectors at once? And we're saying, well, if you try to do everything at once, you probably would end up in chaos. And we're suggesting certain conditions, as you'll see in a moment, to make all of this happen. But we think doing it one sector at a time allows both countries, DPRK and ROK, to make the adjustments in those sectors. We're talking about two-way trade here. So we're talking about a lot of goods and services moving up from South Korea to North Korea. But equally, we're saying that North Korea must be able to export into South Korea. And that will create some challenges for South Korean farmers. And therefore for the political system. So if North Korea suddenly is able to export its fruit, its vegetables, its flowers, its marine products, if they can suddenly flow into South Korea without any trade barriers or any problems, they will reduce prices in South Korea. They will compete with South Korean farmers. And that's going to present some challenges in South Korean agriculture. So there needs to be time to make those adjustments, to work it out in a way that allows these transitions to take place. There need to be two-way payments and investment flows, and those financial arrangements take a bit of time to put in place. The banking system in North Korea is very different from the banking system in South Korea. And especially if there's going to be international investment flowing through South Korea into North Korea, which you need in order for North Korea to be able to pay for the South Korean goods that are going to North Korea, then this payment system has to be put in place. And we also think you need UN inspectors on both sides of the border. And you may say, well, why on earth do you need UN inspectors? And the reason for that is that, of course, the worry of the US especially, but also the international community, is that this trade will be used to conceal a lot of materials going into the nuclear program in North Korea. So to prevent that happening, you need UN inspectors just to make everybody comfortable and assured that this is not being used for any kind of illegal trading activity outside what has been agreed in terms of the sanctions exemptions, which we're going to look at in a moment. So I think UN inspectors play a very important role here. There may be no intention from either DPRK or ROK of violating these arrangements if they are agreed by the international community. But to make sure that people feel comfortable, you need UN inspectors. So sanctions exemptions, and we're suggesting that, backing up for a moment, I'm sure you understand that DPRK faces enormous problems at the moment from three different elements. First of all, the sanctions imposed by the international community, which effectively stop all trade, imports and exports. And also they face additional problems at the moment from COVID-19 and also from the hurricanes, or rather the typhoons and the floods. But just concentrating on the sanctions issue, if one gets past the issue of sanctions, there's also the issue of DPRK being able to join the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in order to bring down the tariff barriers that are involved outside the peninsula, but that's a second phase for later. For the moment, let's concentrate on simply the stranglehold of these sanctions exemptions on the DPRK economy, which has led it to an extremely, extremely difficult situation right now. So how can sanctions exemptions be given? And we're suggesting that they are requested by DPRK and ROK together to the UN Security Council. Now, DPRK and ROK, obviously, for centuries and millennia have been one country. So there is a foundational doctrine of the United Nations, which is the self-determination of peoples. And it seems inappropriate to have sanctions operating between two halves of the same country. Now, we know the history of this, of course, but it does seem to us that it is reasonable for North and South Korea together to go to the UN if they wish to and ask for the sanctions exemptions for any trade and financial flows just between them. So DPRK still has all the sanctions imposed on all other countries, but not on South Korea. And equally, South Korea is able to trade with North Korea when nobody else can. And that, in a sense, drives a great many relationships in the areas of business and finance. Because they are trading with each other, they can't trade with anybody else. It means that many companies, businesses, transactions, trades and flows of products and goods will flow between those two countries, because that's the one opening that DPRK has to the rest of the world. And this is only one sector at a time. We're suggesting that is cumulative. So you start with agriculture, we're suggesting, and then healthcare and healthcare products, anything related to that sector, anything then to do with education, and then you move into infrastructure, transport, business, finance. All the other sectors follow on after that, we're suggesting. But you just go one sector at a time. And before the Security Council grants those exemptions, North and South Korea have to agree joint goals for that sector and how they plan to align their institutions. Now, how would they do that? Well, obviously, it just needs a lot of sitting down and having discussions and negotiations. We think it can be facilitated by international meetings, conferences, consultations where international experts come in, which is what we did effectively in the South African context when they wanted to nationalize the mines. The ANC, I should say, wanted to nationalize the mines and the banks and so on. And it was a block to moving to formal negotiations with the South African white government. We had suggested through these international conferences different ways and approaches that could be used in order to overcome that problem and bring about some policies for banking and mining, which both the white establishment and the ANC could both feel comfortable about. Now, so we believe these joint goals can be found. And if they're agreed, it is a very clear signal to the international community that it is safe to allow these sanctions exemptions for that sector, because it is part of the plan moving towards the possibility of future unification, which will then hopefully resolve the problem of the nuclear weapons as well. Now, I think the other condition that the international community will have is that there must be what I've called here confidence building measures in place. So it seems to me that it's unlikely that the US and the UN and Japan and other countries will agree to these, this trade and the opening up and the sanctions exemptions being given to DPRK unless DPRK and ROK together agree something like the confidence building measures that were agreed back in September 2018. Perhaps the firing of no missiles during the period of the 7-year agreement, so that if there's no firing of missiles in those 7 years, no firing at all, it's easily monitorable. You can see missiles flying. You can't see nuclear research, which goes on under a mountain, but you can see missiles flying. Then if there are no missiles flying, then you allow the sanctions exemptions to stay in place. But as soon as any of the confidence building measures are broken, then we think the UN will simply do what's called snapback. They'll simply say, well, we're withdrawing that again now because the deal is not being kept in terms of these security measures. So those things have to be in place. Those are the 4 conditions. Again, we can come back in questions if you like. So the 4th proposal, which I think some people, at least on the ROK side, have found very difficult to swallow, is the idea of a great exchange of professionals and students. And the issues are around security issues. Imagine that there are 30,000, at the moment, 30,000 North Koreans living in South Korea, escapees. What do you call them? What's the word? I've lost it. Defectors is the word, yeah. So are they all really genuine defectors? And the security services in ROK, of course, have to try and make sure that they track those people and what they're doing and so on. And they're thinking, well, and now imagine 50,000 students coming or professionals coming to work in hospitals and schools and universities doing graduate studies and undergraduate studies. If these 50,000 come over 7 years, all right, it's not starting straight away, but if they come, imagine the security nightmare. And you can imagine in DPRK, they'd probably feel the same thing. A sort of a total panic about, well, how would we manage this? Now, why then are we saying that this is so important? And we think it's extremely important for several reasons. Firstly, we think that it is vital to have social face-to-face contact between people from DPRK and ROK, so they're able just to have discussions and get rid of a lot of stereotypes about what people are like in the other place. There's some idea of what education is like in North Korea. Well, perhaps it's totally false. I mean, how do people in South Korea know what it's like? Because they haven't been there, they haven't experienced it. They hear from defectors, but do they get the whole truth from defectors? So you need people to be coming over. You need the professionals to start learning each other's ways of doing things and have discussions and get to know and trust each other at a personal level. So if, for example, North Korean doctors were to come and work in South Korean hospitals, or if South Korean doctors were to go and work in the public health sector in North Korea, they would learn from each other how they think, how they work, and see the benefits of each other's systems, so that they were able then, if the 2 Koreas come together, to work together in hospitals and in the public health system in a way that's really effective, just because they know each other. They can call each other on the phone, they can have a discussion, they can work out problems. But if they've never met each other, how on earth is this going to happen? I think the other factor that's important is that if you're going to modernize the North Korean economy, you've got to bring in many sophisticated banking arrangements. You've also got to, so you need a lot of training in how to start businesses, how they're going to work, and how the banking system will work and the financial system will work. And you also need expertise in how you manage and prioritize sectors in a multi-sector modern economy. And we think the only way that those skills can be learnt in a short time by North Koreans, where they don't have often a great knowledge of English or German or Russian or Japanese or any other Chinese or any other language, so they can't easily simply go and work in other universities around the world, is that they come to South Korean universities and learn those skills at a graduate level, so that they can go back and then provide the leadership that's necessary in the future administration of North Korea. So there is a question of how you increase the educational capital in North Korea, which has been suffering for such a long time now from not being able to send students overseas and not having access to sufficient people with PhDs. Now, that's not to say that the North Korean educational system is totally inadequate, or that it doesn't produce some very highly skilled people in these sectors. It's just saying that North Korea clearly knows and understands that it needs people trained in, for example, business skills and how to manage large enterprises, which is why it's sending people across to Singapore, I understand, for that kind of training. Well, we think they need much more of that kind of training, and it could be available in South Korean universities. So those are the goals of the exchange, and we understand it will need to start slowly and regionally. Talking to my friend Young-Gil Lee, he believes, and I think rightly, that South and North Kangwon are very open to be doing pilot projects in this area, and would like to be some of the first to try out these kinds of exchanges of professionals and students in our universities. So we think that that would be, for example, a very good place to start some of these exchanges, but it will need to be, obviously, in the end, national. We expect Handong Global University also to have students from DPRK. We hope very much within 3 years or maybe 5 years, we hope you will have a good number of these DPRK students studying alongside you in Handong. And then international investment and technical support. So why does this international involvement matter so much? Well, it's partly about building confidence between the international community and the North and South Korean governments as they embark on this journey, if they decide to do it. So the very fact that you've got technical experts and you've got a flow of funds from multilateral and bilateral donor agencies flowing into the Korean Peninsula with the expertise and the oversight that's involved from those agencies will build the confidence of those countries that this can work and that there is the motivation to make it work. And obviously getting them involved increases the amount of money available for modernizing North Korea. It means that North Korea can be modernized without relying on China, for example, exclusively. And why and how can China finance the modernization of North Korea by itself? It would like a modernized North Korea. China would like that for its Belt and Road project and in order to bring stability in its northeastern states and for all kinds of other reasons. But the international community can help provide the investment that's necessary to bring the modernization about and to start to raise North Korean income substantially, so that you don't have such a huge income difference between people living in North and South Korea. And the kinds of technical support, it may be agricultural research, it may be the whole processes of rapid agricultural development. Although North Korea has done extremely well, they can still step it up another level, we believe, particularly through technology. Or it may be in engineering areas of a practical kind. Again, DPRK has shown extraordinary capabilities. Or it may simply be in the financial and business sectors. But in all of these areas, we believe international investment and technical support can be useful. So that's a summary, again, of the 5 key elements in what we call the mutually agreed social convergent development process. Mutually agreed economic and social convergent development process. So we're just going to move a map from the wall here, which has decided to fall down. Just give me a moment, please, while we do that. Thank you very much, Stephen. So here are the 5 reasons we think. Again, please come back on it in questions if you want to. We believe that it shows respect both for the DPRK and ROK values and economic and social systems. I think sometimes people in South Korea think, well, you know, there's an obvious solution to this. Why doesn't South Korea simply take over North Korea? Why doesn't it just kind of put its capitalist system into North Korea and then everything would be wonderful? Well, I don't think it would be wonderful for a moment, and I don't see any reason why DPRK should accept that. But if the process involves something which North Korea have participated on, in which their values are demonstrable, can't say the word, can be shown to be respected, and the positive sides of their culture are also included, which ROK, we believe, greatly needs, as I'll come back to in a second, then we think that DPRK will be much more open to doing that. It's vital to move away from any sort of concept of older brother, or younger brother, older brother in the relationship between DPRK and ROK. All of our peace building work has shown us that mutual respect is an essential foundation for getting progress. DPRK have said over and over again that what they need more than anything else is release from this sanctions stranglehold. A stranglehold in murder mysteries, which I watch sometimes, a stranglehold is where you crush the breath out of somebody by holding their neck very, very tightly. And this stranglehold, which is destroying the North Korean economy at the moment, they have to find some way to get that released. And this is a way to release that stranglehold, not all on one day, over a period, but in a structured way that offers them maximum control over the process. It is a route to rapid modernization, which we know is something Kim Jong-un really, really wants. And then it's a process back into the international community. It's not being so isolated anymore. It's opening the opportunities for multilateral connections and multilateral trade and multilateral access to universities and so on. And I think for DPRK especially, there's no precondition of denuclearization. You don't have to denuclearize first. I heard a story that the generals in DPRK went to see Chairman Kim and said to him, we want you to know that we will never, never, never denuclearize. We are totally committed not to denuclearize. And this is because of their recollection of what happened in Libya, because after all the agreements and the security promises and everything, the US and UK and other countries ended up bombing Tripoli. And they just don't want to see that happen to them. And then, why would ROK accept this process? Well, we believe the security risks are still real. I don't think that DPRK would want to drop a nuclear bomb on Seoul. You'll be all relieved to hear among the Handong students, because anyway, any nuclear fallout would blow back up into North Korea rather easily. It's only 17 miles from the border after all, and there are sometimes winds from the south or from the west. So, but the security risks are still real. A firestorm, for example, which it would be impossible for ROK to stop if it got into any kind of war situation, could destroy pretty much the whole of Seoul with massive numbers of deaths if DPRK were inclined to do it. And one can't assume this will never happen. I mean, so many people I've met in ROK just don't believe anymore that this is a real risk. I think it is still a real risk. It shouldn't just be buried. It could possibly still happen. We pray it won't. Secondly, it opens up economic growth possibilities. So where is the ROK economy going next? It's grown very, very rapidly since 1960, probably the most successful economic growth performance of any country in the world. Within 60 years, from one of the 10 poorest countries in the world, within 60 years, it's one of the 10 richest countries. How has it achieved that? But the problem is now that the growth is flatlining. And with the impact of COVID, among its major trading partners, which are China and the US, it seems likely that it's going to really struggle to continue getting any economic growth. Now, one way to renew growth and renew the growth dynamic would be if it was possible to start opening the possibility of trade with North Korea. And then thirdly, there's a slow burning crisis, but it is really enormous for South Korea. So at the moment, the workforce in South Korea is about 38 million. By 2060, it will be below 18 million. That is less than half what it is today. And that's on what I believe now are fairly optimistic assumptions, because ROK has the lowest birth rate in the world, the lowest number of children born per adult woman. So there is an enormous crisis developing here. And every year it gets worse. You can see the impact in Japan, and Japan, by the way, has a much higher birth rate than South Korea. And yet you can see the empty rural areas, you can see the empty schools and hospitals, and you can see it in South Korea. The number of students coming to university is going down all the time. The annual intake to the South Korean universities just goes on going down. And to reverse that is not simple. It's not enough just to give a woman $2,000 to have a child. It's much more deep-rooted. It needs a whole change in thinking and values and understanding of who we are as a people to change a demographic crisis like this. And we also believe that South Korea's got a huge challenge as the tensions increase between the US and China. So South Korea has chosen not to be a member of the Quad, that is the countries in Asia that are supporting the US position in this global tension between China and the US. But it is a member of the RCEP, the new ASEAN global trade agreement that was publicly launched, I think, last Sunday, but still has to be signed off by the different governments. But that is potentially going to be a third of global GDP, an enormous trading bloc, and China is in it. The US is not in it, but ROK has chosen to join it. So it is joining with China on that side of on that range of issues, but it's not joining with the US and the Quad on the security issues. So you can see ROK is moving, it seems, more towards being connected to China in this global tension. But on the other hand, clearly the special relationship between ROK and the US and its dependence on the US for its ongoing security for the time being means that it has to keep its relationship with the US. How does it navigate the challenges, and how do you prevent the DMZ becoming a new front line in a new Cold War with China, in a sense, backing North Korea and the US backing South Korea, and this being the front line? And nobody wants that. DPRK doesn't want it, ROK doesn't want it, and I believe it's bad as well for both the US and China to be looking across the DMZ at one another and having all the tensions that are built up by that happening. So we believe, in summary then, and finally, that international peace depends crucially on the DPRK relationship getting resolved. If you can solve that relationship, and there's a possibility in the future of a neutral, multi-connected Korean peninsula, that's the dream, which can relate to US and China and Russia and Japan without any anxieties, because it's a neutral, multi-connected neutral state, then that seems to me the best possible outcome for everybody, including the neighbors. We believe that this social harmony between DPRK and ROK depends on these shared values and an alignment of institutions and policy goals. And lastly, but not least, I want to stress the importance of reconciliation and forgiveness. And this is not just because I come from a Christian starting point where reconciliation and forgiveness are absolutely foundational in my Christian faith, certainly. In South Africa, one of the key problems they had to overcome was how to deal with the issue of those people who'd been in the South African white government and who'd been responsible for the security arrangements, which had led to the brutal murder and torture of many ANC activists and in their military wing. How were those people not going to be brought to trial and sentenced either to death or many, many years of imprisonment? Why would they hand over power? Why would these very powerful people in the government of white South Africa, why would they ever relinquish power? And the same sorts of problems are there, not exactly the same, but same sorts of problems in North Korea. So in North Korea, why would people in very influential positions in North Korea want to move towards unification if it meant that, as happened in East Germany, they lose their jobs, they lose their status, they lose their position? Why should they be willing to give those things up? And equally, they may have even more fears. If they're in the security apparatus, they may be thinking to themselves, well, if we do this, what happens to us? Are we going to be publicly humiliated? Are we going to be tried for things that we've done against humanity? What happens to us? So the Truth and Reconciliation pattern in South Africa provided an escape route, a safety valve for this building pressure. I mean, basically, it said if these people in security services would come forward and admit what they'd done publicly, then they would be able to go free. They would never stand trial. Now, that's quite a difficult thing for some people to swallow, because if you think that people have violated human rights in that way, you may just think that's completely unfair and wrong. But you have to say, well, if that's the only way to take the whole situation forward, perhaps we should agree to that. But also, you want, in the end, reconciliation. And what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did in South Africa was allow the possibility for those people who wanted to simply to say sorry, rather like Chairman Kim said sorry recently for the death of that South Korean civil servant who died swimming across trying to reach North Korea, it seems. Now, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, some of the people who'd done the worst things, thrown bombs into churches and killed people randomly, or blown up cars, or destroyed the lives of ordinary innocent bystanders, they came forward and they not only admitted they'd done it, but they said to the people who were there, whose relatives had died, they turned around and looked at them in the eye and they said, "We want to apologize for what we did." Now, it was driven by a set of political circumstances. You could say it was outside the personal control in some sense of those people who did it, but they took responsibility and they said sorry. And from that moment, extraordinary reconciliation started to take place. And there was the healing of many, many very difficult relationships that otherwise would have remained as running sores for years and years and years. So we think a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to govern the situation in future, if ever there is unification, would be a key institution, and for DPRK to know in advance that that is something that ROK was willing to support and facilitate. Anyway, I've said more than enough, I think. That's all I wanted to cover. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we will then have the opportunity for some questions.